Do you remember your childhood? Do you remember the games you indulged in as a child, playing hide and seek and playing tag? Some of the sweetest memories of your childhood, probably. But mine are a bit different. I was born in a household of 8 siblings. It was the late 50s. I was the youngest. The oldest brother was 16 when I was born, and I remember the hazy image of my father, a tall guy, wearing a yellow check shirt almost every day, and always returned home drunk. Did not bother to ask us anything. I was too small to remember it all. But this is what my mother recalled about him whenever I asked. She told me that he never picked me up or cradled me or talked to me. I have no regrets of it. This is the story my elder brother told me. And this story was the reason we all split and were sent to other families. It all happened at the beginning of the 60s. My sister Lucille, my brother Daniel, my other brother Lawrence, and my elder brother John, they all were out in the backyard. I think they were playing tag or something like that. It was then that our neighbor knocked and he gave the 2 tickets to my mother. They were the tickets to see Elvis perform. Now, if you know who Elvis is, then you must know that what big of a deal it would be to see Elvis perform. Now, there were only 2 tickets, but there were 4 of them competing for the tickets. Everybody wanted to go, but no one was ready to back out and give the ticket to their brother or sister. My parents were conservatives, so there was no chance that they would let them easily just have the tickets for Elvis' show. So they begged and begged to let them take it. When my father returned, my mother told him about the tickets, and my father was pretty adamant about tearing up the tickets. And he said, "Well, this is devil's music. Unless y'all are the devil in disguise or worshiper of it, I would not let you go." My brother John spoke up and said that this is not devil's music, and raising a voice to your parents was surely the easiest way to get smacked. But my father had something completely else in his mind. He took the tickets and raised it over a glass jar and said, "Well, all right, if you want the tickets, you have to earn it." And that is when we put on a wager. It was simple. All 4 of the contenders will be participating in a series of games, the children games, and the last 2 standing will get the tickets. At first, the kids were relieved, and they just presumed it would be an easy bet since all they had to do was probably run or hide or do all the stuff kids do. So the first game was tag. Now, tag is an easy enough game, but our sinister parents had something completely else in mind, and they made our siblings go barefoot. And then they were made to compete in tag. At first, they didn't really understand the seriousness of it all, but it hit them. As they were told to play tag in the hot gravel and sun, and as they did, blisters popped and burned their feet. As everybody except my eldest brother gave up and went back inside. But that wasn't enough, and they set on the witch hunt. Now, it was the turn for hide and seek, they said. But as they were hiding, my parents would pinch the sibling hiding or inflict some sort of pain to get them to give up their location. But my siblings were tougher than the usual and would do everything to not give up that. Eventually, by the time game ended, Lawrence gave up and closed himself in the room, crying endlessly. But the 3 were still not ready to give up on Elvis. About 3 more excruciating games later, my brother decided that it was enough, and in a ruse of the game, he went on to call the police on my parents. And my siblings to this day recall that it was the right decision to make. None of them got to see Elvis live, but they were very much happy that they all get to be away from the abusive parental relationship. Now I watch this Squid Game, and I am remembered of the time this all happened. Later on in life, we did make our peace with Mom. She was very sorry for everything that had happened. But my dad was just another level of scary and crazy.
The single most messed up memory from my childhood involves dictaphones. You know those little voice recorder things with little tiny tapes? Yeah, I used to think they were so cute. Now they trigger me super hard. And before y'all call me a snowflake or whatever, listen to my story. When I was around 11 years old, 5th grade anyway, I went to sleep over at a friend's house. We stayed up late, doing all the stuff you'd expect young ladies to get up to at a sleepover. Then we all passed out and slept through the night. The next morning, the girl whose house it was, her dad comes into the kitchen with a little dictaphone in his hand. He's got a big smile on his face, and right in front of us, he starts playing the tape back. We all hear our own voices, talking about our crushes and all this other stuff. He'd been recording us, and apparently, he'd hidden the recorder in one of her stuffies or something. I'm honestly kind of freaked out by this, but I'm too shy to actually call him out on it, so we all just sort of let it go and chalk it up to a weird dad behavior. Years later, the girl and her weird dad move away and we all lose contact as we go our separate ways. Then, about 14 years later, the girl finds me on Facebook. We do a little small talk, catching up on this and that, and then the girl drops something heavy on me. She asks if, during that sleepover, all those years back, if I remember anything weird involving her dad. I'm all like, sure, he recorded us. That was incredibly weird. A little bit of a total invasion of privacy, maybe? She's like, no. Anything else? I had to tell her no because honestly, nothing else did happen. But the question sparked off a little online reunion, with all the girls who had social media getting in touch with one another because we'd all been asked the same question. It took a while for the truth to come out, but to our horror, we discovered that the girl had been getting abused by her father. The whole idea of recording our conversations that night wasn't part of some kooky prank or whatever. It was him making sure she didn't say anything about it to her friends. Of all the dark or scarier incidents from my childhood, that one takes the cake. Not so much because of how horrible it is, and it is horrible, but because of how he basically gloated to us, playing it back because he knew she didn't say a freaking thing about it. I think he escaped justice in the end. I'm not even sure she started investigating, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, until he was long gone. She's doing fine, by the way, but I still think about her from time to time and hope she really is doing okay, as she says she is.
Back in 2004, me and the wife decided we couldn't face freezing our bits off for yet another British winter, and started looking for a more tropical location to spend the festive period. We were working on a bit of a budget and couldn't quite afford the Thai or Vietnamese beaches we'd had our hearts set on. But after a little bit of searching, we came across this lovely little beachside bed and breakfast in a little town called Galle on the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka. It was definitely priced a budget hotel, but the photos the owners had taken showed it to be quaint, clean, and beautiful little place. And once my wife was taken with it, I had very little choice in the matter. So I made a booking. The food was amazing. The people were welcoming, and the beaches were everything we could have hoped for. Come Christmas Day, we had the most unusual Christmas dinner of our lives, sharing a veritable banquet of different dolls and curries in a local restaurant. And it was so good that neither of us missed pigs in blankets that year. And I'm sure most of you will agree that's really saying something. We finished off with a few drinks on the beach, stuffing every so often to giggle at how surreal it all was. Then we were sunbathing on Christmas Day. Then, once we were drowsy enough, we headed off to bed for an early night. The next morning was even better. No hangovers, no dodgy leftovers to work through, no going down the local park in the freezing cold to pretend that a brisk Boxing Day walk is anything but an absolute bollock. Just sun, seas, sandy beaches for 5 more days. Me and the wife replaced the horrid Boxing Day park walk with drinks and nibbles in the beachside cafe, nibbling on dips and papadums, wondering how we were going to readjust to life back in the UK again. I mean, it had been literal paradise for almost a full fortnight. We could have never have possibly guessed in that moment Then, our festive little Asian trip would turn out to be the biggest mistake of our lives. But we soon learned that a dream day can turn into a living nightmare in just a matter of minutes. So we're just sitting there in the open-air restaurant, holding hands, both enjoying that lovely rhythmic sound of the waves gently breaking against the beach. And suddenly, it stopped. We heard that big rush as the water was pulled back away from the shore. But no crash followed. And me and my wife watched as the water crept further and further back away from the shore. And I don't mean like a few feet or anything. It just kept going and going until you could barely see the edge anymore. And there was only wet sands as far as the eye could see. I distinctly remember the moment I saw these tiny specks on the wet sand in the distance. And now it almost looked like they were jumping up and down. Only that's exactly what they were doing. They were fish that had been swimming in the shallows when the water had just disappeared. Now they were flapping around in the sand, gasping for breath. I turned to see the young waitress standing behind us. And I'm about to ask her what was happening, but her face told me all I needed to know. She was golfing even harder than we were and had obviously never seen anything like it in her life. The next thing I know, there are people running out onto the wet sand with plastic bags, scooping up the fish into them before moving on to the next port flounder. It was actually quite amusing for a moment, thinking it must have been the easiest morning's fishing that any of them had ever experienced. But the next moment, I hear this absolute roar of a shout coming from down the beach. An older man was bellowing something out to the lad scooping up fish. Then he turns and starts shouting with his hands kept around his mouth, like he's trying to announce something to everyone. I turned around to the Sri Lankan waitress to ask what was being said. But by that time, her dad showed up, the cafe owner I later found out, and he has this horrified look on his face. I could tell he was looking out to sea. So I turned to see what he was looking at. And that's when I saw that the water was starting to come back in. Only it wasn't returning as gently as it had descended. It was getting faster and faster, and the way he was getting bigger and bigger. "Sir, madam, please come upstairs," I remember the owner saying. Suddenly, there was a big wave coming. A very big wave. "We must all go upstairs now. Very fast, please." The cafe was basically a big hollowed-out concrete block, so I was confident that we would indeed be safe if we went upstairs where there was another open-air dining area. The only trouble was getting everyone up there, as the owner's elderly mother was confined to a wheelchair. I didn't actually see her at first. She was in another room when we all started to move. So I was halfway up the stairs by the time I saw the owner wheeling her to the bottom. It was honestly one of the most horrifying moments in my life. This horrendous "oh no" moment, because the guy was trying to pull her up the stairs backwards in the wheelchair, but he clearly didn't have the strength to do it on his own. I basically pushed my wife up the stairs and then forced my way back down them towards where the owner was struggling with his mom. I grabbed one handle and he grabbed the other, but that wasn't working. So we tried actually carrying the whole thing by grabbing the wheel spokes, but again, that wasn't working. The whole time, I could hear the wave getting closer and closer. My poor wife from the top floor saying, oh my God," as it's getting nearer to break. Then it struck. We didn't have the owner's mom up as high as we needed, and all this water and debris came crashing over us. It was pure chaos for a second. I was grabbing onto the banister, into someone's arm or leg. I couldn't tell who was just holding on for dear life. All of a sudden, the water level drops a bit, but it's still rushing past us. This lets me see that I've got hold of the owner's arm, while he has hold of his mother's hands. The wheelchair was nowhere to be seen. Like it was there one moment, gone the next just dragged away by what turned out to be a 15-foot-high tsunami. I'm sorry if my reading starts to take a turn at this point. Remember, all of this is really, really painful, and I'm sure you understand why in just a moment. So I'm pulling with all my might, trying to keep the owner, and by proxy his mom, from being washed away. That was just too heavy for me to drag out of the water. And I'm actually struggling to hold on to myself. So I'm absolutely terrified that I'm going to lose grip, which not only do I die, but they die too. I can't even express how ashamed I am to say this, but there was a moment when I thought about just letting go. I know that sounds absolutely soulless, but the kind of terror I felt at that moment, I'd never experienced anything like it in my life. It was like something else just took over for a moment. Screw everyone, but my kind of attitude that placed my life above all else. But even in that moment, I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself. It just seemed out of the question. If I lose grip on them, if they get ripped away from me, that's different. But for me to just let go seemed a bit too much like murder for me to go through with it. Next thing, I'm snapped out of that horrible moment by screaming from the owner and his mom. They're saying things to each other in their language, so I don't have a clue what they're saying. I thought I could pretty much guess that. They'd be saying, "Don't let go. I don't want to die. I won't let you go, Mom." Stuff like that, but then I'm choking up as I write this. The owner suddenly let go of his mom's hand, and that she might have slipped or something. But the way he turned so purposefully and ran back up the stairs, I knew that he just let her go. I was stunned, absolutely stunned. But as I said, I'm just in survival mode. So I'm following him up the stairs to the safety of the top floor. I feel my wife bear hug me with this full body impact before she burst into tears. It hadn't occurred to me, but because she hadn't been able to see what I was doing, she thought I had been washed away. She's crying and screaming at me, "Where did you go?" I swear I wanted to tell her, but I just couldn't. Instead, I looked over the edge of the open-top dining area, and I just gasped at the utter destruction below us. The entire landscape had been completely transformed. It was almost unrecognizable, and the water just kept going and going inland, never slowing down, never stopping. I remember the moment I realized that could have been happening to the entire island. Just miles and miles of coastline, completely and utterly destroyed in just a few minutes. Although it was bad enough when the water was coming in, it was even worse as the tide dragged it back out again, because all the death and destruction that was caused bulldozing its way inland, it was pulled back past us as the water returned to the ocean. There were so many bodies. I lost count. Every other second, you'd see a patch of pink or brown flesh floating on the surface, maybe a streak of color from someone's clothing. There were so many dead. Someone who just didn't see it coming. But the hardest part for me to bear was yet to come. When the majority of the danger had passed, and it was just stagnant water on the floor below us, the owner and one of his sons ventured downstairs to bring up what little food and what otter they could salvage from the flooded kitchen. We knew rescue wouldn't be quick, and people already working their way through the mess outside, pulling out dead bodies and survivors, like me and my wife pitched in as best we could. But the fact remains that there just wasn't much we could do at that stage. other than tried to comfort the handful of people with us Sri Lankans included the night. None of us could sleep, even with the free beer that the owner had given us. So when I saw him smoking a cigarette in the darkness on his own, I thought it might give him a bit of company. I hadn't smoked since I first tried in sixth form college, but the night I asked him for a smoke, and we shared a beer in a second silence. Then, out of nowhere, he says, "I didn't want to let her go." I didn't even really know what to say to that. I know he was referring to his mom, but I didn't know if he was just trying to rationalize it or what. So I just nodded. I told him, I know. But he shook his head. He goes on to tell me that his mom had told him to let her go. She knew I couldn't pull them both in. She also knew that it wouldn't be long before we'd all be dragged off. So she sacrificed herself for us. The owner told me what their little exchange had been, and I swear to God, it almost broke me. He said it went something like this. "Let me go, son. Let me go." "No, Mom, you'll drown." "You don't let me go, wild trout. Just hold on. I've had a long life. I've had a good life. You've been a good son, and you made me very proud. But your family, your needs to take care of Deuce. I tell you, I love you, Mom. I love you too. Goodbye." He said he couldn't bring himself to say goodbye. So he just let her go. Turned and went to look after his family, just like his mama told him to. This all happened nearly 16 years ago, and I still can't talk or think about it without tearing up. I can't even imagine being in that situation. And just knowing it happened was completely traumatizing. So God only knows how he actually dealt with it himself. I think that's why this has been so helpful to type up. I can't really talk to anyone about what happened that day. People beside the wife anyway. Either get frustrated that they don't understand, or if they ask too many questions, or worst case scenario, I start thinking about the owner's mom. I choke up, and then there's no more talking at all. So rather than suffering the embarrassment of being a grown man in tears, I just shut my mouth and tried to deal with it. But I don't really think there is anything to deal with. I think to an extent that trauma just becomes a part of you. It doesn't hurt anyone. It's not debilitating, but it's always there. Like the scar left after a deep wound. You just learn to live with it.
When I was 11 years old, I took my little sister trick-or-treating in our neighborhood. Long story short, there was a lot of trouble back home between my mom, my dad, and my stepdad, this guy called Craig. Craig was a jerk. My mom was a drunk, and Dad was fighting for custody of us. As you can imagine, it was incredibly stressful, and it definitely accounts for one of the most miserable times in my life. But that night's trick-or-treating ended with an absolute low point that I feel very lucky to have escaped. So I took my sister around the neighborhood, and we did okay in terms of our candy haul. Then by curfew time, I walked her back to our house, where we found Craig was waiting for us. He looked livid, but we weren't late coming back or anything, so as my sister walked back into the house, I gave her my bag of candy while Craig walked off toward the garage. I kept asking him what was going on, but he wouldn't say anything to me, and as he handed me some gloves, a shovel, and a trash bag, it felt a whole lot like I was being punished for something I didn't do. Then, as I followed him into the woods behind his house, I saw that he had a little hatchet in his hand. The last time I saw anyone with these items in tow, it was some neighbors going to butcher a deer that had been caught on their property. Poor thing had almost disemboweled itself on some razor wire and bled out during the night, and our neighbors must have had a heck of a time getting rid of it. So, as much as I'm kind of nervous about what's going to greet me at the end of our little walk, I couldn't have any idea how horrible it truly was. After about 10 to 15 minutes of walking, Craig tells me to stop and start digging a hole where I'm stood. I ask why, and he tells me to shut up and do as I'm told, which wasn't out of the ordinary, but after only a few scoops of dirt, he stops me. He asks if I want to know why I'm digging, and of course I told him yes, and he tells me that I'm actually digging my own grave. I thought it might have been a Halloween prank or something. One in bad taste, sure, but a prank nonetheless. Then he starts telling me about how my dad has a custody hearing coming up in 2 weeks and that it's my job to make sure that he doesn't win. If he did win, the hole I was in the middle of digging would become my grave. I was 11, dude. 11 years old. And this grown man is telling me how I need to, stop some entire legal proceeding or whatever. That, or he'd kill me, presumably with the hatchet he had in his hand. After that, we picked up all the stuff we'd brought out with us, then walked back to the house. All these years later, parts of me wonder why I didn't react more viscerally to actually being threatened with murder. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just sort of accepted it. I imagine this is what my therapist calls my childhood traumas, and that I was just so burned out with the abuse and fear and the misery that I just took it in my stride. But I'm sure you'll all be pleased to hear that my dad ended up winning custody purely on the basis of him not having any kind of criminal record, while my mom's and Craig's rap sheet was like a mile long. Craig wasn't so smart either, as when the judge ruled in my dad's favor, me and my sister went right home with him. We never saw Craig again, and since my mom refuses to leave him, I haven't actually seen my mom since the hearing. We've talked on the phone a bunch, but I've no desire to see her in person. Not if Craig is still around.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.